All right, let's talk about function return values. We've talked about arguments. We know that if you have an argument signature with two variable names, that means that when you call the function, you're going to need to have the same number of variable names. If I call it with 0 arguments, I'll get an error. If I call it missing 2 positional arguments, if I call it with 1 value, I'm going to get an error. Again, missing 1 required. If I call it with too many, I'm going to get an error, in which case it'll say add them takes 2, but 3 were given. And if I give it the exact same number, we're going to see that it works the way it should. I guess I've got some extra output here. So let's stick an exit in there. Great. So let's talk about return values, because as you can see, there's a statement on line 5 that says return. And as you can see as well, I'm assigning the call to add them to a new variable. Now I want you to compare this to other functions that we may have used in the past that do not have return values. This is one of the most challenging things for some students to really understand, and that is that when you want a value to come back from the function, you must return it. Now in this particular case with greet_me, we're simply printing we're printing a new string based on the arguments. That's all that greet_me does. If you think about it, there are some functions that we know that don't return anything. For example, print doesn't return anything. Exit doesn't return anything. On the other hand, we have other functions that do return things. So here's a couple of functions that don't return anything. Here's a function that does return something. What is the value of x? It's 5, right? Here's another function that does return something. What's the value of y? It's going to be 3.5. Now in the case of lines 4 and 5, we have functions that accept return values. The functions are designed to give us back a value that we can use. On the other hand, we have two functions here that don't return anything. Now you can see the difference on how they're called. Print and exit don't expect any return values, and so they don't assign their return value to a name. We're not saying A equals print. We're not saying Y equals exit. We're simply calling print and exit, and we're not expecting a return value. Instead, we're expecting what we call a side effect. That is, something is happening as a result of our function call. In the case of these two functions, however, we are expecting two return values because the functions are designed to return something. Now I want you to look closely at how we're calling add them. Add them expects a value to come back. In fact, add them is basically just a simple summing function that will sum two values and then return the result. Look closely at how I'm calling add them on line 7. And also look at the last line of add them. You can see that I'm returning my sum from add them, and I'm assigning the return value to numSum in line 7. The connection between line 5 and line 7 must not be ignored. This is one thing that I find a lot of students skip over when I explain it. If you're returning a value, the value that you return gets assigned to the name. That's how return values work. Again, looking at our previous example, you can see there is no return statement. And you can also see that we are not assigning the call to a variable. No return statement, and we are not assigning the call. A return statement, and we are assigning the value to a call. So this is of utmost importance that you see the connection between the return statement and the assignment. If you ignore it in the future, and what a lot of students will do is they'll call the function like this, and then they'll maybe just print my sum here. There's no return statement here, and thus numSum will have a value that we're not expecting. What's challenging about this for many students is that because they're printing it, they feel like the value must be going back. But what does print do? All print does is echo a value to the screen. That's it. That's all that print does. It does not return a value. Now you can see I'm a little bit excited about this because a lot of students miss it. And I'm not sure why they're missing it. Clearly, return is doing something. And if return is not there, it's not going to do that thing. Well, what does return do? It allows a value to go back to the variable in the call. That's what return does. So what is the value of numSum at this point? Actually, it's a value called none. So what students will do is they'll see 15 and they'll say, well, my function worked, but now I see this really weird none, and I don't know what none is. None is what got returned from add them when it doesn't return a value. So saying it doesn't return a value is actually not correct. What the function actually does is returns none. The default return value of any function is none. And so numSum is the value none. So how do we fix this? How do we allow numSum to get the value that we've computed in add them? We return the value, return mySum. Now we're not going to see none because none is not being returned. Again, the principal misconception on the part of many students is that if you print the value, it must mean that the value got returned. But printing only shows it to the screen. It is returning that will get us what we're looking for. That is the returning of a value Now, some folks ask, why is x a different name than mySum? MySum is the variable that we defined inside the function. Why don't we say mySum equals add them? We actually could, but I always use a different name to show you the distinction. The fact is, mySum is a variable that only exists inside the function. And when we come outside the function, the value is getting assigned to x. And so x now has the value. This is the nature of a return statement. It is returning a value from the function to be assigned to a name out in the call.